state what the transition to democracy achieved. Yes, the transition was complete in a normative constitutional sense when the amendments finished in 2002. But it took another half-decade for much of it to be implemented in a regulatory and institutional sense. The first direct elections for regional heads were held in 2005, but the first direct presidential elections were not held until 2009. And the courts were not able to independently administer themselves under one roof, satu atap, until around 2006. And some parts of the transition, for example, guarantees of human rights, have never been fully achieved and implemented. Now, part of the reason for this slow implementation or failed implementation is that the old elite groups, politicians and oligarchs, began to work out how to play democratic politics, dominate the political system and win power. And so, under the rule of President Jokowi, the process began to reverse. President Jokowi's rule saw a drift away from liberal democracy that was slow but steady and which accelerated in his second term as president. It was a creeping return towards the authoritarian model of the new order. President Jokowi said, quote, "Our democracy has gone too far," unquote. And he set about reversing it. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that the new order model was revived under President Jokowi, but I am saying that many of the democratizing reforms of the post-1998 period, or Reformasi, were steadily undermined during his rule as president. Next slide, please. Away from ideological optimism about democracy that Fukuyama had articulated in the 1990s, a shift towards the far right, with authoritarianism mounting challenges to the liberal democratic model all around the world. The US, with Trump, in Russia, India, Hungary, Italy, France, and the Netherlands, among many others. Indonesia has not been an exception to this process of the rise of the far right. In fact, it is fair to say that the decline of liberal democracy in Indonesia under Jokowi has now led Indonesia, like the US, to a historical inflection point, where the question of whether liberal democracy will survive intact may well be decided one way or another. President Prabowo Subianto has made it clear what his views are on this question. Soon after his election, he said, for example, democracy is really very, very tiring. Democracy is very, very messy and costly. And on its website, Prabowo's political party, Gerindra, still has as its #1 mission statement a return to the naskah asli of the Constitution of 45. Mempertahankan kedaulatan dan tegaknya negara kesatuan Republik Indonesia yang berdasarkan Pancasila dan Undang-Undang Dasar 1945 yang ditetapkan pada tanggal 18 Agustus. Itu naskah aslinya. So that's the #1 mission statement of Gerindra. #1. So a dislike of Reformasi-era democracy is not unique to Presidents Jokowi and Prabowo or Gerindra. It is shared by many politicians from other parties, including PDIP and Golkar, with Gerindra the largest partners. And both PDIP's leadership and senior Golkar figures have spoken in favour of a return to the original 45 constitution, although no one has yet made this a formal proposal. Next, please. So let's be clear about what Gerindra, you can't read that, but that's Gerindra's actual website as of today. Let's be clear about what this #1 mission statement involves. If Indonesia did return to the naskah asli of the 45 constitution, it would mean reversing most of the liberal democratic reforms introduced after the fall of Suharto. It would reverse the amendments that transformed Indonesia from a repressive military-backed authoritarian regime to an emerging democracy with implemented separation of powers, independence of judiciary and press freedom. Let's be really specific about this. Next slide, please. A return to the naskah asli would mean No more presidential term limits. No more directly elected presidents. No more human rights guarantees. No more separation of powers and judicial independence. And to be really clear, a return to the naskah asli would mean the Constitutional Court simply stops existing, and that would be the end of judicial review in Indonesia, because all of those reforms were delivered by the constitutional amendments. So if the amendments aren't there, then neither are those reforms. This is a chilling prospect, although admittedly it is still only a mission statement. It's an idea. It's not yet a concrete proposal. But in reality, the challenges democracy faces in Indonesia may be more immediate, although a little bit more subtle. Even if the naskah asli is not revived, much of Indonesia's Reformasi democratic system has already been damaged, and the journey back to that new order model is already underway by other paths. So next slide, please. To explain, I want to discuss just three key elements that form part of the new order system, although there are plenty of others. This is not everything about the new order, but I'm picking out three particular issues, otherwise I'd talk to you all day. So I'll just reduce it down to three. Military domination of civilian life, lack of judicial independence, and absence of freedom of expression. And let me now explain to you quickly how the process of legally reinstitutionalizing each of those elements of the Orde Baru is already underway. New slide, please. First of those three elements, military domination of civilian life. The new TNI law allows civilian jobs to be occupied by serving military members in 14 ministries or government agencies, 14 ministries or government agencies, and increases the military retirement age. And in fact, of course, this complements the amendments to the civil service law, the ASN law, passed in October 2023 under Jokowi. And Article 19 of that law allows members of the Army and Police to take civilian positions, and already members of the Army and Police have been appointed to a range of civilian positions. Article or Pasal 7 of the amended TNI law also allows the expansion of military operations other than war, selain perang, allowing soldiers to undertake operations, for example, against perceived cyber threats on the basis of instructions directly from the President. In other words, the Army can involve itself in digital communications surveillance. The amendments also allow the government to extend the retirement age of TNI personnel, including senior commanders. There is currently an oversupply of middle and high-ranking officers within TNI. And the question becomes, as the retirement age is expanded, what to do with this large number, this excess of senior officers? The answer is, of course, to give them civilian posts and civilian jobs. The other answer is to grow TNI's organisational structure by adding new military regional commands. So the number of Kodam in Indonesia increases from 15 to 37, and will keep going until it is across the archipelago. And this is, there's another presidential regulation under Jokowi, number 66 of 2019. So all these laws together are a step towards reinstituting, next slide please, reinstituting the new order territorial system by which the army shadowed the civil administration across Indonesia, and of course Dwi Fungsi, by which the army was a partner in power with the government. Now, to be clear, this has not happened yet. Indonesia is not under Dwi Fungsi. Yes, officers have been appointed to civilian roles in government, but it's nothing like the levels it was under Suharto. But, this is the point, the legal changes I have described mean that it is now possible for this to happen legally in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Erosion of judicial independence. The Constitutional Court law is one of the most amended laws in Indonesia. Politicians can't stop amending this law because they see the MK as one of the only institutions remaining that can check and balance the power of the government. The MK has certainly had its problems, including with its leadership, and some of those problems have been very serious. And of course, it is certainly possible to criticise individual judgments that the court has made. However, the MK has provided both Indonesia's first public forum for serious debate on the interpretation and application of the Constitution, and its first significant and easily accessible body of detailed and reasoned judgments. It's created a body of jurisprudence on liberal democracy, which never existed in Indonesia before. And it has to be acknowledged that some of its judges have made great efforts to create a new model of judicial decision-making and explain the working of the liberal democratic system. And there are some who are still willing to courageously say no to bad laws, even bad laws that the government really, really wants. And these are essential things if liberal democracy is to survive and flourish. The current RUU to amend the MK seems to be a clear attempt to weaken the court. Since the MK was first set up, the President, the DPR and the Mahkamah Agung have been able to nominate 3 judges each. Under earlier versions of the law, judges could serve for 2 5-year terms. The nominating institutions could reappoint their judges for a second 5-year term after the first 5-year term, or they could refuse to do so and so sack them. And some judges were sacked in that way. In 2020, judicial terms were abolished and the tenure of judges was increased to 15 years. Now, the new amendments currently being considered would reintroduce the 5-year terms. And this would mean, like in the original model, the DPR, the Mahkamah Agung and the President would be able to refuse to give approval to continue office to judges. And this would mean that judges who have served more than 5 years could be immediately removed. Now, this has 3 very serious consequences. 1, it allows the government to stack the court, to fill the court with judges who are sympathetic to it. Secondly, it obviously puts judges who dissent, who disagree with the majority, at risk of being removed. And 3, judges will now have a strong reason to approve bad laws to keep their jobs, because the nominating institution can remove them if they become a nuisance for judges, for the nominating institutions and government. So if these amendments pass, a second element of Suharto's new order could well be back in place. A lack of true judicial independence and no effective check on the constitutionalism of laws that are passed. Now, as we saw under the new order, a constitution loses legal authority if governments can pass laws that contradict the constitution without any fear of annulment. The constitution becomes a dead letter. New slide, please. And my third element is restricting freedom of expression. The proposed amendments to the 2002 broadcasting law, also currently being discussed, severely limit the scope for the media to perform its critical liberal democratic role of holding the government accountable. As mentioned, the new criminal code that comes into force next year already prohibits criticism of government, reviving some provisions of the current code that the Constitutional Court previously declared to be unconstitutional. That's pretty bad. But the proposed amendments to the broadcasting law goes further by banning exclusive broadcasting of investigative journalism content. And this broadcast term is defined to encompass video content distributed via digital platforms. And this would prevent the dissemination of investigative reporting in audio-visual formats. And that's important because most Indonesians get their news not through print or TV anymore, but online. So if that law came into force, that would mean no more dirty vote, for example. That would become illegal. And Article 51E makes it clear that broadcasters who breach the law can be criminally prosecuted. In other words, the potential reach of these new provisions is enormous, and they could be used to stop the press and civil society more broadly from carrying out one of the fundamental roles of the press, holding the government to account. Now, this new ban, if it comes in, will probably violate constitutional rights to freedom of expression and will almost certainly end up in front of the Constitutional Court, as will the provisions of the new criminal code, which the court has said it will review after they come into force next year. So what that means is that the independence of the Constitutional Court is absolutely critical, as it is probably the only institution that could stop or at least soften these potentially devastating threats to media freedom. If the MCAR cannot do that, then a third element of Suharto's new order will be back in place: lack of press freedom and thus the absence of government transparency and accountability. So, next slide please. So these three regressive legal changes, along with others I don't have time to talk about today, such as the Ormas law and the KPK amendments and others as well, all of these seem to be small steps back towards rebuilding and reinstating the new order system. And of course, we have proposals to declare Suharto a national hero in a few days, which is also part of that same gradual rehabilitation of the new order system. Their effect will be to turn Indonesia back towards the authoritarian systems that emerged under the Naskah Asli, or the original 45 constitution, without actually needing to go back to that Naskah Asli at all. A next step in the undermining of democracy would be to end direct elections and remove the two-term limit, all of which have been criticised by politicians in the past. The government's ruling coalition constitutes almost the entirety of the DPR. So it clearly has the numbers in the DPR and the MPR to make these kind of amendments to the Constitution. It hasn't tried to amend the Constitution yet. One reason for that is that politicians are afraid to reopen the constitutional amendment process because they worry they might not be able to control where that process goes. This is the so-called Pandora's box argument. But that view might be shifting. In the wake of the protests in August, we have seen a major crackdown on civil society, and this has resulted in the arrests of almost 1,000 activists, and more importantly, the intimidation of many more. Certainly politicians are going to be nervous about provoking public protests again, but there is also the possibility that the combination of the government's domination of the DPR and the intimidation of civil society may make ruling politicians confident that make further legal changes that will strengthen their position. If not now, then in the year ahead, when the government feels more secure. That's why I said this is an inflection point, where the future of liberal democracy will be decided in the next 4 years. Legal and political change hardly ever moves in a straight line, direct and simple. It goes in fits and starts, attempts and failures, retreats, sidesteps, as politicians test power, policies and ideas, look for legitimacy and support, retreat in the face of protests and opposition, and find new ways to win. But in my view, the overall trend in Indonesia under Jokowi and since is pretty clear. Back to the future, towards the model of the Orba. So my last slide, please. Or not my last slide, but almost last slide. So at the start of my presentation, I quoted George Santayana saying that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. American author Kurt Vonnegut has responded saying, quote, "I've got news for Mr. Santayana, we're doomed to repeat the past no matter what." I hope Vonnegut is wrong, at least in the case of Indonesia. Remembering what really happened in the past, whether it was in 1945 or 1965 or 1998, remembering what the new order was like and how it functioned, is very important for making decisions today. And because a large part of the voting population in Indonesia was born after the end of the new order, they never experienced, they don't know about it, and because history projects are emerging that rewrite the history of the new order so that the reality of how that model functioned is being lost, it is a problem. Legal history matters. So in conclusion, if a decision is ever made to return to the Naskah Asli, then Indonesia would most certainly be going back to the future. The Reformasi process finished a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago. But a return to the Naskah Asli would decisively mark the end of Indonesia's second and longest period of liberal democracy. Next slide. But I've argued today that the end does not have to come as a bang with a formal return to the 45 Constitution. It can come as a whimper, less suddenly, more quietly, slowly. This may be more likely, that liberal democracy will end as a result of gradual erosion by creeping authoritarianism, with sequential legal changes building on each other to to slowly eat away at the key pillars of democracy, which include the media, until there is not much left but a shell. And in my view, that process has already begun. Last slide, please. So many things are necessary to defend liberal democracy and resist the possibility of a creeping return to deep-seated political traditions of integralistic authoritarianism. But three things are particularly important. First, publicly articulating the dangers of a return to the new order model, maintaining a vigorous public discourse, a discussion about constitutionalism and liberal democratic values, and understanding what was wrong with the new order system, not forgetting it. Second, supporting and defending the integrity of the Constitutional Court, the MK. Without powers of enforcement, that court could only be effective if the government is willing to follow its rulings. Now, it usually does so, but not always. Sometimes it ignores them. And the MK must always walk a fine line between, on the one hand, upholding the Constitution, and on the other, keeping the government sufficiently on side to ensure it follows the court's rulings. Public support for the court, especially when it is under attack from politicians, is absolutely crucial to the authority of the court and to the court's survival. So how to create public support for the MK? History again suggests the answer, and this is my third and final point. So my first point is articulating a constitutional liberal democratic debate and understanding what was wrong with the new order system. The second is defending the MK. The third is the way to do these things. Supporting and encouraging civil society activism in the face of arrests, trials and government hostility. To enable the defence of, among other things, activists, human rights, freedom of expression and association, separation of powers, judicial independence, and, in particular, the amended 1945 Constitution, which enshrines these ideas. Thank you for your patience. Terima kasih atas kesabaran.
Baik, terima kasih banyak Prof. Tapi saya izin untuk mereview sedikit ya Prof, karena audiens kita adalah student. Jadi tadi Prof Tim mengajak kita bersama untuk melihat ya bagaimana reformasi hukum dan demokrasi di Indonesia ini yang menunjukkan tanda-tanda kemunduran ya, seolah kita ini kembali ke masa lalu, yaitu pada masa Orde Baru. Padahal Indonesia telah sempat keluar dari masa Orde Baru itu, telah banyak terjadi perubahan besar ya. Salah satunya adalah dari presiden seumur hidup menjadi ada batasan jabatan, lalu kemudian ada pemilu langsung yang secara terbuka, ada judicial review ya, ada Mahkamah Konstitusi yang hadir setelah masa reformasi tersebut, dan juga mengembalikan TNI ke barak ya. Itu adalah perubahan-perubahan besar yang telah terjadi setelah masa Orde Baru. Namun kemudian praktik yang terjadi saat ini seperti yang disinggung oleh Prof Tim tadi, praktik yang terjadi saat ini itu menunjukkan kemunduran atau seolah-olah kita itu kembali pada masa Orde Baru yang dicirikan oleh 3 elemen ya, seperti yang disampaikan oleh Prof tadi. Yang pertama adalah militer sekarang sudah mulai aktif kembali atau sudah mulai memasuki ranah sipil lagi. Kemudian adanya pembatasan pers atau media yang itu merupakan salah satu elemen ya atau ciri khas pada masa Orde Baru. Bisa dilihat dari adanya KUHP baru, kemudian RUU penyiaran dan lain sebagainya yang menunjukkan bahwasannya memang pers saat ini itu dibatasi ya Prof. Lalu yang ketiga adanya erosi independensi, yaitu upaya untuk melemahkan Mahkamah Konstitusi yang bisa dilihat juga dari kebijakan-kebijakan mengenai Mahkamah Konstitusi itu sendiri. Lalu jadi pada akhirnya intinya dari penjelasan Prof Tim tadi adalah bahwa Indonesia ini beresiko ya untuk mengulang masa lalu yang otoriter jika kita lupa pada nilai dasar reformasi itu sendiri. Mungkin seperti itu reviewnya Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan mahasiswa sekalian. Untuk selanjutnya kita dengarkan dulu pemaparan yang kedua. Pemaparan yang kedua akan disampaikan oleh Prof Saiman. Beliau adalah Professor of Indonesian Law dan telah lama meneliti serta mengajar mengenai sistem hukum dan peradilan di Indonesia. Karya-karya beliau seperti Indonesian Law, lalu kemudian Judicial Dysfunction in Indonesia telah banyak menjadi rujukan utama dalam studi hukum Indonesia modern. Oke, tanpa memperpanjang waktu, mungkin kita dengarkan bersama pemaparan dari Prof. Simon. Pada Prof. Simon, the time is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Selamat pagi Bapak Ibu sekalian dan teman-teman para hadirin yang saya hormati. Semoga sehat. Nah, Prof. Tim tadi mengatakan memang posisi Mahkamah Konstitusi dalam sistem ketatanegaraan Indonesia sangat penting sekali. And that it is really one of the few remaining institutions in Indonesia that will be able to, or will potentially be able to hold the government to account and perhaps to prevent wind back of democratic control. I wanted to focus on why the Constitutional Court is pivotal, is central. Why is it so important? There are scholars who spend all their time outside of Indonesia in particular writing about constitutional courts and how they operate and how they hold governments to account or not. Indonesia is a place of interest for many of these comparative scholars, comparative constitutional review scholars, many of whom are also political scientists. But there are many different types of constitutional courts around the world. And so what I want to do this morning is talk a bit about why Indonesia's constitutional court is so important, but also to compare Indonesia's constitutional court with other constitutional courts around the world, and also other courts that you may have heard of, like the US Supreme Court, which is not a constitutional court per se, but exercises constitutional functions. Lanjut, please. For the next slide, please. Oh yeah, good. Thank you. Terima kasih. So, Prof. Tim, he spoke about this term constitutional review. Ya, apa itu? Apa yang dimaksud dengan istilah constitutional review? Well, secara dasar, paling mendasar, it is the power to review something to make sure that it complies with the Constitution. So a court usually reviewing something, a law, maybe a government action, maybe a policy, to assess whether it complies with the Constitution, to assess whether it is in accordance with the Constitution. Now, around the world, this function is usually performed by a superior court, so a court that is very high in the judicial hierarchy. As I will explain in a minute, that is a general feature. In fact, in some courts around the world, even the lower courts can decide constitutional questions. Contohnya di Amerika Serikat, di mana pengadilan negeri atau setingkat pengadilan setingkat di Amerika Serikat, dia bisa memutuskan masalah konstitusional. Jadi bukan saja Supreme Court di Amerika Serikat. Now, in America, where the lower courts can decide constitutional issues, this is often described as decentralized constitutional review. That's because power to review whether the government is acting in accordance with the Constitution is left to many lower courts, not just the Supreme Court. This is unusual in comparison with other courts exercising constitutional jurisdiction. Most countries have what Indonesia has, which is a single constitutional court that's focus is to determine constitutional issues. And that is sometimes called the centralized version of constitutional review, because power is held by a central high court with specific power to assess compliance with the Constitution. This model, the centralized model, the one that most countries in the world use, is based on the Austrian Constitutional Court model that was developed by Hans Kelsen in 1920. And it has been very, very influential around the world. Now, Tim and I come from Australia, and Australia has a slightly different system. So on the one hand, I've described centralized. On the other hand, the US system of decentralized. Australia, I think, fits somewhere in the middle. We do not have a centralized constitutional court. We have a high court, which is the highest court in Australia, that can decide constitutional issues along with all of the other issues of law that arise in Australia. So it's not a specialized constitutional court, but it does exercise constitutional jurisdiction, as does a constitutional court that is a separate institution. So it's not really like a specialized constitutional court. And I suppose it's a little bit like the American system where courts can hear constitutional issues and other types of legal issues as well. Yeah, it's a bit different and unique, I suppose. One of the other, lanjut tolong ya. Oh, sorry, sebelum lanjut. I just want to explain on the slide here, on the bagian kanan. Yeah, I have a very brief chart, maybe quite difficult to read on the slide, about the development of constitutional courts around the world. So Indonesia, as Prof. Tim says, developed a constitutional court, established it in 2003 after the fall of Suharto. Now, Indonesia was one of the last countries to establish judicial or constitutional review through the establishment of a constitutional court. I said the first one was in Austria in 1920, but the idea of having one really started to gain momentum after World War II. And some of the countries involved in World War II, perhaps that had questionable responses in World War II, were amongst the first to develop constitutional courts after the Austrian Constitutional Court. So countries like Germany and Italy were both early adopters to try and prevent what had happened in the lead up to and during World War II occurring again. So to prevent the government from, for example, re-establishing a Nazi regime or a fascist regime. But then after World War II, we had another wave of development of constitutional courts. I can't actually read that myself. What have we got? So as countries began to adopt democracy more completely around the world, one of the common elements unsur yang umum yang lazim as part of democratic change was the establishment of a constitutional court. Now, this is, I suppose, the main point for you to remember from today. Many countries, when they have been democratizing, like Indonesia, decides to protect human rights and put a list of human rights in the constitution. So the right to life, the right to vote, the right to express an opinion, the right to development, these types of rights come into the constitution. And many of the countries that I've mentioned have what we call a Bill of Rights in Australia, a list of rights. Now, it becomes the task of a constitutional court to make sure that the government respects those rights. So when the government passes a law, buat undang-undang, it's the constitutional court that makes sure that the law that the parliament passes or the legislature passes is respecting of those human rights. And this is a very significant power, particularly in a democracy where the constitutional right to vote or to stand for election is included in the constitution. And this leads me back to the Constitutional Court of Indonesia. One of the most important areas of law that the Constitutional Court has, I think it's fair to say, developed in its cases is about electoral law. And a lot of the court's decisions or jurisprudence flows from the fact that in the Constitution there is a right to vote and a right to stand for election. And from this general principle, and also in Article 22 of the Constitution, which says that elections must be free and fair, the court has made many changes to Indonesia's electoral system, and particularly changes to candidacy rules. People who want to stand for election in the DPR or the DPRD or for the presidency must follow the Constitutional Court's decisions about the system that the court has made. I think the Constitutional Court of Indonesia is particularly active compared to other constitutional courts, particularly in electoral matters. Now, this is one of the reasons why constitutional courts, not just in Indonesia, but around the world, are important for democracy. Not only do they help guard the system from changes, they also more broadly, try to prevent the government from violating the Constitution and intruding upon the rights of citizens. So those are just a few of my observations about the constitutional court system that is used around the world, and also the importance of a constitutional court that functions well in Indonesia, if Indonesia is to have a democratic future. Demikian yang bisa saya sampaikan dalam kesempatan ini. Thank you very much for listening.
Baik, terima kasih banyak atas pemaparannya Prof. Kim. Dari apa yang disampaikan, Prof. Simon ya. Dari apa yang disampaikan oleh Prof. Simon tadi, beliau menyinggung atau menjelaskan tentang fungsi Mahkamah Konstitusi ya atau MK dalam sistem hukum khususnya dalam konteks Indonesia, bahwa memang lembaga peradilan yang independen itu sangat penting untuk menjaga reformasi di Indonesia ini tetap hidup. Beliau tadi juga menjelaskan ya apa itu constitutional review, bahwasanya constitutional review ini adalah proses pengujian konstitusional, karena negara kita adalah negara konstitusi, jadi penting untuk memastikan bahwa setiap kebijakan yang dikeluarkan oleh pemerintah atau undang-undang, aturan dan lain sebagainya itu harus dipastikan sesuai dengan konstitusi. Tapi beliau juga kemudian menyoroti ya bahwasannya independensi dari MK ini juga dipertanyakan kembali atau juga menunjukkan tanda-tanda kemunduran gitu. Baik, mungkin seperti itu ya sudah disampaikan oleh Prof. Simon dan Prof. Kim. Untuk selanjutnya kita akan membuka sesi diskusi singkat. Jadi kepada Bapak Ibu maupun rekan-rekan mahasiswa sekalian untuk yang ingin bertanya atau ingin mereview atau ingin menanggapi atau ada yang ingin ditanyakan lah dari apa yang sudah disampaikan oleh kedua pemateri kita tadi, dipersilakan. Baik, dipersilakan kepada Aisyah.
Thank you for the opportunities. My name is Aisyah. Nama saya Aisyah. My question is, what are the effects of restricted press freedom to bureaucracy and public policies in general? Thank you.
Baik. Terima kasih. Baik, kita kumpulkan dulu pertanyaannya. Apakah masih ada lagi dari Bapak Ibu ataupun rekan-rekan mahasiswa yang ingin bertanya? Baik, dipersilahkan kepada Dery.
Baiklah, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sebelumnya perkenalkan, nama saya Dery Sanjaya. Saya merupakan mahasiswa administrasi publik angkatan 2024. Di sini saya ingin bertanya kepada Profesor Timliwisi tentang keterlibatan Tentara Nasional Indonesia dalam sektor publik. Tahu saya saat ini Tentara Nasional Indonesia itu juga ikut serta dalam hal pertanian, Prof. Jadi menurut saya itu ada beberapa efek yang bagus, pertama efek yang bagusnya itu bisa menjaga ketahanan Indonesia. Namun, kembali saya masih bahwa efek yang tersebut yaitu peran petani nasional kita ini akan tergeserkan karena terlibatnya tentara Indonesia dalam hal pertanian. Jadi menurut Profesor Timliwisi, bagaimana pendapat Profesor? Apakah hal tersebut merupakan hal yang baik atau justru akan melemahkan sektor publik atau sipil? Ya, terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Dery. Selanjutnya apakah masih ada yang ingin bertanya? Persilakan.
Alright, thanks for the opportunity. Let me introduce myself. My name is Lumas Alonso, and I'm from Department of public administration. One of the goals of which is to eliminate CCN or corruption, collusion, and nepotism. However, in this current era, such cases are still rampant. According to Prof, what is concrete solution to address this issue? Thank you.
Baik, pertanyaan terakhir dari siapa namanya? Thomas tadi ya? Lukman, oke, terima kasih Lukman. Baik, udah. Karena keterbatasan waktu ya, mungkin kita batasi untuk sesi kali ini. Kita hanya membuka 3 sesi pertanyaan. Mungkin bagi kawan-kawan mahasiswa bisa nanti bertanya untuk sesi kedua ya, setelah penyampaian materi dari Bapak Edi. Baik Prof, ada 3 pertanyaan. Yang pertama, apa impact dari kebebasan pers terhadap birokrasi, lalu kemudian keterlibatan TNI dalam sektor publik yang yang juga menjaga ketahanan pangan Indonesia ya, ada dampak positifnya, bagaimana point of view dari Prof, dan terakhir apa solusi konkretnya. Silakan kepada Prof Tim mungkin terlebih dahulu dipersilakan.
Ya, terima kasih atas pertanyaannya, menarik semuanya. Nah, pertanyaan terakhir, apa itu penyelesaian untuk masalah KKN? If you know, please tell me. Ya, saya tidak tahu apa penyelesaian masalah KKN. It's a very difficult question. Mungkin saya kembali ke pertanyaan pertama, karena mungkin dalam jawaban saya untuk pertanyaan pertama ada jawaban untuk yang terakhir juga. So, pertanyaan pertama ialah tentang kebebasan pers. Dan biasa seringkali orang melihat liberal demokrasi dan mengatakan yang dasarnya ialah trias politika, yaitu eksekutif, legislatif, dan yudikatif. Tapi sebetulnya ada 4 unsur dalam liberal demokrasi, dan unsur yang sepenting ketiga yang lain ialah yang keempat, yaitu media atau pers. Itu sering disebut dalam bahasa Inggris sebagai fourth estate. Fourth estate atau bagian keempat dari liberal democracy. Mengapa? Karena peranan media antara lain ialah untuk mengawasi ketiga cabang pemerintah yang masyarakat yang lain, yaitu eksekutif, legislatif, yudikatif. Yudikatif ialah semacam watchdog. Tapi media lebih penting daripada yudikatif. Karena bagian apa yang akan mengawasi yudikatif juga tidak lain dari media. So, berarti kesimpulannya ialah media ialah sebagian yang sangat penting untuk adanya liberal demokrasi. Tanpa media yang pers yang bebas, sebetulnya tidak mungkin ada liberal demokrasi yang betul. Tidak mungkin. Karena terlalu mudah bagi eksekutif untuk take over semua cabang-cabang pemerintah yang lain. Misalnya lihat situasi di Indonesia, tempat legislatif sudah menjadi satu koalisi. Nah, intinya legislatif ialah tempat untuk debat. Seharusnya ada oposisi dalam cabang pemerintah yang namanya legislatif supaya demokrasi berarti. Kalau ada semacam takeover koalisi yang menguasai semua atau ada mayoritas yang begitu besar sehingga oposisi tidak berarti, itu masalah besar di liberal demokrasi. Tinggal apa? Tinggal cabang sistem demokrasi yang lain yang bisa mengawasi pemerintah. Kalau tidak ada legislatif, tinggal yudikatif. Nah, kalau yudikatif juga dikuasai oleh pemerintah, itu sudah mulai menjadi otoriter, sistem otoriter. Hanya tinggal media yang bisa mengawasi semua cabang lain. Dan kalau media tidak bebas, okay, it is all over. There is no liberal democracy. So, kebebasan media sangat penting untuk kesehatan eksekutif, legislatif, dan yudikatif dalam sistem liberal democracy. Itu salah satu sumber untuk checks and balances yang jadi intinya liberal democracy. Dalam sistem liberal democracy tidak ada cabang pemerintah yang bisa menguasai semua yang lain. Semuanya mengawasi yang lain, masing-masing mengawasi. They monitor and supervise each other, and media is key to that. So, jawaban untuk pertanyaan terakhir ialah untuk menyelesaikan masalah KKN, pers, yaitu media, ada peran yang sangat penting untuk mengawasi KKN di pemerintah, di legislatif, yudikatif, dan eksekutif, legislatif, dan yudikatif. Itu di tangan pers. I put it another way, that you can have an anti-corruption commission, you can have criminal prosecution, but if the government controls the judicial system, it doesn't work. So you have to have an active media to control corruption. It's very important. Nah, pertanyaan kedua tentang keterlibatan TNI dalam di dunia pertanian. Nah, itu juga sesuatu yang kembali ke definisinya liberal democracy. Masalah dengan militer ialah militer yang ada senjata api. Semua masyarakat yang lain, semua golongan-golongan masyarakat yang lain, they do not have the weapons. Karena militer yang mempunyai senjata api, peranannya harus sangat terbatas. They have the power, so they must be more restricted than any other part of government or of society. So, setiap kali ada militer yang masuk bidang itu berbahaya. Itu langkah-langkah yang sangat berbahaya. Mungkin militer bisa membantu petani-petani di sektor pertanian. Mungkin mereka bisa membantu polisi. Mungkin bisa membantu dalam beberapa peranan tertentu di beberapa bidang. Tapi semua itu sangat berbahaya karena militer yang ada senjata api. Karena itu mereka tidak boleh keluar dari barracks. Mereka harus sangat dikuasai dan kekuasaannya harus sangat terbatas. So, yes, the military can help, but it's very dangerous. So you should not use the military in civilian roles because of the danger. That's the principle of liberal democracy, that the army must be under civilian control and its role tightly restricted. Even if it can be useful, it should not be used except for military purposes. Okay, baik.
Terima kasih, Prof. Tim. Dan saya juga mau menambahkan sedikit mengenai press freedom dan juga korupsi. Memang press freedom and korupsi itu saling erat ya, kaitannya. Kalau tidak ada press freedom agak sulit memberantas korupsi karena accountability itu tidak dibuka. Jadi cerita yang sebenarnya mengenai korupsi, bagaimana caranya, siapa yang terlibat itu tidak bisa dikenal publik, dan oleh karena itu tidak akan ada dukungan publik untuk melakukan perubahan. Nah, menurut saya kalau tanpa KPK yang kuat agak sulit memberantas korupsi juga. Ya, sebagaimana dikatakan Prof. Tim, if the law enforcement is part of the problem, it is impossible for them to be part of the solution too. Yeah. You cannot clean the floor with a dirty broom. Tidak bisa menyapu lantai dengan memakai yang kotor? Sapu yang kotor. Ya, nggak mungkin bersih kalau begitu. And that is a fundamental problem. If the police, prosecution, and the courts are involved, it's very difficult. And about press freedom, a very good question. Tim has talked about the importance of press freedom. Yeah. He's talked about the importance of press freedom in a democracy. But one of the counter issues is about how we prevent press freedom and also the freedom of expression from being used as a justification to slander. Yeah. So how do we balance the importance of maintaining a person's dignity and honor on the one hand with press freedom on another? We have in Australia, but also in Indonesia, a law about defamation of fitnah, yeah, and how to find a balance between freedom to criticize and freedom to express is very difficult. So in America Serikat, there is a freedom of speech in the Constitution and very weak law of defamation. In Indonesia, maybe it's quite a strong law of defamation which can be used to take action against critics. So it's a difficult balance to make, and different countries make the balance in a different way.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Tim dan Prof. Simon atas jawabannya. Jadi pada intinya adalah memang kebebasan pers itu merupakan bagian yang sangat-sangat penting dari demokrasi ya, karena bisa mengawasi semua cabang dalam sistem demokrasi trias politika termasuk yudikatif sekalipun. Kemudian mengenai pertanyaan keterlibatan TNI ya, jadi meskipun TNI itu dinilai memberikan dampak positif mungkin di beberapa bidang, tapi tetap saja karena TNI memiliki senjata, ketika dia mulai masuk ke ranah sipil, itu adalah salah satu tanda bahaya atau hal-hal yang sangat membahayakan. Siap, terima kasih Prof. Tim dan Prof. Simon. Baik, karena masih ada waktu, mungkin kita bisa lanjut sesi 2 dulu, Pak Edi. Kita dengarkan bersama dulu pemaparan dari Pak Edi mengenai, kalau tadi kita sudah bicara tentang reformasi dari sisi hukum dan demokrasi. Nah, Pak Edi nanti akan menjelaskan tentang reformasi jika dilihat dari konteks pemerintah daerah. Oke, kepada Pak Edi dipersilahkan.
Parlemen. Ya. Kita kembali ke dalam negeri ya. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Bapak sekalian yang saya hormati, Pak Isan, Bu Said, Bu Hoja, dan kawan-kawan dari para dosen, Prof. Kim dan Prof. Simon, kemudian Profesor semua. Oke, bagian saya mungkin banyak terkait nanti dengan beberapa mata kuliah ya. Di sini ada juga mahasiswa kepemimpinan. Kita ingin lihat perjalanan reformasi birokrasi. Ya. Tadi apa yang disampaikan oleh kedua Prof tadi gambar Indonesia, sebenarnya itu karena kerja birokrasi. Ya, itulah kerjanya para birokrat, orang-orang yang memang digaji oleh pemerintah untuk menjalankan pemerintah atau negara ini. Ya. Maka seberapa jauh perubahan-perubahan sikap dari para penyelenggara negara ini juga akan menentukan keberhasilan dari apa yang ingin kita capai setelah reformasi ini. Saya ingin sedikit melihat perjalanan reformasi birokrasi setelah pasca 98. Ini adalah awal terbentuknya perubahan mendasar ya, dari yang sebelumnya di zaman Orde Baru itu sangat sentralistik ya. Kalau dibilang tadi seperti otoritarian, kemudian penguasaan dan segala hal ya, mau militer, mau birokrat, partai, semuanya ada di satu tangan pemerintahan, ya waktu itu namanya Pak Harto. Tapi Reformasi 99 itu mendorong ya beberapa perubahan-perubahan besar dalam segi penyelenggaraan pemerintahan, ya terutama pembentukan undang-undang tentang pemerintahan daerah, ya. Termasuk juga berkaitan dengan perimbangan keuangan pusat dan daerah. Kalau zaman Orde Baru itu semua tersentral, ya, yang menentukan pembagian jatah anggaran itu ada di pemerintah pusat. Sehingga beberapa daerah penghasil mungkin sumber daya alam dan sebagainya itu tidak mendapat bagian kecil, ya, tidak seimbang dengan apa yang mereka keluarkan. Ini juga harus diminta pertanggungjawabannya atau akuntabilitasnya. Nah, disinilah mulai perkenalkan apa yang disebut dengan LAKIP, ya, laporan akuntabilitas kinerja dari instansi pemerintah, ya. Atau kemudian juga diberi nama dengan sistem akuntansi kinerja instansi pemerintah. Nah, inilah yang kita lihat seberapa jauh perjalanan itu setelah pasca itu hasilnya hari ini. Masuk era ketiga, ya. Next. Era ketiga adalah, nah inilah yang kita sebut era reformasi birokrasi, ya, ada modernisasi